Okay.
Good evening. My name is not Mike Wallace, but my name is Robert Sarason, and I'll be moderating a discussion between Richard Bensinger, a lifelong union organizer and former National Organizing Director of the AFL-CIO, and Richard Winfield. Richard Winfield is a Democratic candidate in a special election for United States Senator from Georgia in November, followed by an election by the two top vote getters on January 5th. Winfield has held previous conversations like this with Professor Noam Chomsky on democracy, economist Pavlina Chervina on the case for a job guarantee, and with Shashi Tharoor, member of parliament in India and former Undersecretary General of the United Nations on globalization and unemployment. All of these discussions can be heard on winfieldforsenate.com. By way of introduction, Richard Dien Winfield, we can call him REW tonight, is a distinguished research fellow in philosophy at the University of Georgia, where he has been teaching since 1982. He is a member of the United Campus Workers of Georgia, CWA organizing Local 3265, which is seeking to unionize all employees at the State University System of Georgia. Professor Winfield previously ran for the U.S. House seat in Georgia's 10th Congressional District before running in the special election in November. Richard Bensinger is a veteran organizing leader who currently focuses today on building industry-wide organizing campaigns. He first helped organize a union at a ski and tennis racket factory in Colorado in the 70s. He recently helped organize Spot Coffee workers at their 8 locations in upstate New York. Richard helped restructure the United Auto Workers Organizing Department and directed the UAW's transnational organizing program that focused on Nissan, Toyota, Mercedes, and Volkswagen. When Richard Bensinger was the National Organizing Director of the AFL-CIO, he strongly advocated for unions to dramatically change to become relevant to 100 million plus non-union workers and direct more resources to union organizing rather than focus exclusively on a shrinking 13 million members. In 1990, he helped found the AFL-CIO Organizing Institute in Washington, D.C., to help train the next generation of union organizers, particularly women and people of color. A few preliminary words. First, some ideas tossed around tonight will sound different than what you would hear with Trump and Vice President Biden. Nonetheless, they are not beyond reach. Just witness the fact that parts of Bernie Sanders' platforms were incorporated into the Democratic Party platform, and the idea for a non-means tested universal income check was incorporated into the first bipartisan relief bill for the COVID-19 epidemic. Second, while there will be criticism of the ideas of the mainstream of the Democratic Party, there is universal agreement among both Richards and myself that everyone should vigorously support Joe Biden for president and unelect Donald Trump. As Noam Chomsky pointed out, Donald Trump is an existential threat to our fundamental democratic institutions. Next, after I've asked for questions, we can go to the chats for questions, so please write your questions in the chats. Finally, I must disclose that I'm not neutral in this discussion, since I spent over 20 years in the labor movement as a lawyer for union organizing efforts by the Industrial Union Department, AFL-CIO, in the South, followed by organizing coordinating work for the Service Employees International Union, SEIU. The first question is for Richard Bensinger, and I apologize for its incredible broadness. Since news of unions or workers do not regularly appear in the mainstream media, could you please update us on some of the current trends in the labor movement and union organizing, both accomplishments and challenges?
That's a big one. Well, good evening. Thanks, Robert, for the question. You always were one of my favorite organizers in the South. And Richard, hello, good to see you.
Good to see you, and good to see you, Robert.
Well, I think the main thing is that in my lifetime, this is the best moment for organizing in terms of worker anger, worker exploitation, particularly if you're looking what the pandemic has done to people of color, to immigrant workers, where the weight of this virus has fallen worse on working people than all working people, and particularly those working people that are stuck in the worst jobs, which has to do with race and immigration status and everything else. So there's an opportunity, and I guess I've always felt that where you need only organizing isn't that complicated. You need two things. You need a really good worker committee ownership of the workers, and there's certainly a lot of workers I think today that want to own the organizing process and join committees. And you need a union willing to bring the resources to bear to bring some type of hammer down on employers, some type of pressure to prevent employers from firing people and not respecting the right to organize. So what I see is where unions are putting that together. There's some where I see the unions like the ATU. There are union leaders and union organizers. Brilliant organizing director of the ATU. I was just talking about Chris Townsend, where he's winning election after election in the bus industry. The pandemic's only created a bigger crisis in that industry. There's a brilliant organizer, John Murphy, and in the commitment of his union Unite Here all across the country is organizing targeting airports, big projects, thinking boldly. And so there's others too. And I was involved, I think if you look at just the issue of millennials, young people, Gen Z, millennials, I was involved in a campaign, you alluded to, Spot Coffee in upstate New York. We just signed the first contract a couple of months ago, which I learned more. The older I get, the less I think I know what works in organizing, the more I think I learned from other people like the spot workers. They formed a committee, and the leaders of the committee were Phoenix and Phillip were immediately fired. But the union, led by a really adventurous young millennial labor leader himself, Gary Banadana, just declared war on the company and enlisted the labor community up there to the Western New York AFL and the progressive community and the customers of Spot, and just said, they fired the leaders of the union, which side are you on, to use the old union slogan, and the public overwhelmingly supported the workers. They boycotted the Spot Coffee, and within 3 weeks we had an agreement that they would, we call it non-interference agreement, covering the entire corporation across all of upstate New York, and won an election by 93%. We would have lost that election if we voted it without a agreement, and we do that. So they got a contract with the lowest wage increase, immediate increase was $2.35. The highest was $6 an hour, and the average wage increase was $4 immediate plus benefits. So that's how you increase wages. It's not just statutory reform or legislation, it's building worker power. So anyway, that's enough of an opening speech, but that campaign was successful because of incredibly courageous leaders and and showed community support for the right to organize. And
Richard, would you like to jump in?
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I think you can sort of frame the whole situation of labor in the US in the following respects. First of all, we have the most, I would say, regressive labor legislation in any democracy, where very, very, very little is provided for workers by law compared to what other countries guarantee them. And we can go into that in due course. Such things, for example, you can't be fired at will in most other countries. You have paid leave and paid 1 month vacations. You're not allowed to have mandatory overtime. Of course, you have healthcare that is provided separate from employment, and you have pensions that are provided separate from employment. All of these things are provided, including parental leave of all sorts, paid family leave. All of these things are provided by law, so unions don't have to fight over them to begin with. Also, of course, our minimum wage is generally speaking far below that of most other industrialized countries. But secondly, we have a much lower rate of unionization now. It's now about 10%, which puts us at the very bottom of democratic and industrialized nations, or I should say developed nations. And when you think of that 10%, keep in mind that it's 6% in the private sector, and it's about 33 going on 34% in the public sector. But public sector unions are really, to some degree, they operate in name only, because in many states, particularly all the southern states and many others dominated by Republican legislatures, you have right to work laws, whereas in Georgia, where I am, you're not allowed to strike, and you're not allowed to even engage in collective bargaining. All of these rights, by the way, are mandated by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to which we are signatories. So in a way, we're operating in a sphere in which more than about 9 out of 10 Americans are not in a union. They're there alone. And then in addition to that, we have absolutely zero role for employees in the governance of corporations or enterprises, private or public, unlike other nations. And then, of course, we're in this environment of a kind of free trade environment with the development of globalization and multinational corporations, where it's becoming more and more tough for workers to defend their rights when multinational corporations can transfer operations elsewhere, to go in this drive to the bottom in terms of wage levels and benefits. And then you have the development of the gig economy, where now employers don't have to have a regular workforce in place with any guaranteed hours or any opportunity for solidarity. Everything can be farmed out through cell phones and the internet 24/7 anywhere in the world. And this is becoming more and more a factor both here and elsewhere, which again makes it extremely difficult for workers in these fields to be organized. And I think we see it in that if you look at all of the new industries being set up, all of the new kinds of commercial ventures, almost none of them are unionized. I'm looking at the screens here, and I think that we're all of a similar generation. We grew up when the 3 biggest employers in America were AT&T, Ma Bell, General Motors, and Ford Motor Company, all of which were union, all of which paid wages that sort of kept pace with the growth of national productivity. Now the 3 biggest employers are Walmart, McDonald's, and Yum Foods, and probably Amazon is catching up or is going beyond them, in part thanks to the pandemic. So we're really in a situation where the labor movement is really struggling against the changing situation. It makes it extremely difficult to expand its membership and defend the rights of workers. And well, I'll leave it at that for the time being.
Well, Richard, just going to to put it one step even further, is in terms of globalization, I mean, no matter what any one country can do, there's no international law on worker organizing. So when you talk about, well, countries have these rights, but there's no restrictions on globalization of capital.
Sure. I mean, after World War II, there was an international trade organization was going to be set up, and it was going to be committed to full employment. But it ended up not being accepted by the various international parties and was replaced by the World Trade Organization, which had no such commitment. And I think that's a measure that I think is also worth keeping in mind, the importance of having a job guarantee as something that really strengthens the labor movement. I think some of you here knew Ron Blackwell, who eventually became the chief economist of the AFL-CIO. He was always telling me that the labor movement is making a mistake by putting as much energy as it is in pushing for a living wage, a minimum living wage of $15 an hour. He said what instead is much more important is to have a federal job guarantee. And why? Not just because it wipes out unemployment, but because it really strengthens the position of employees who have a job. Because you now have the tightest labor market. You don't have this reserve army of the unemployed, which is out there ready to take your job or lower wages, et cetera. You're really in a much stronger position to bargain for rights. The fear of firing is very much undermined. And I think that's something to keep in mind as well.
Can I get for it? during Stigley Audi and Company's fall.
Richard, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, no, Richard Bensinger.
Oh,
Yes.
In terms of the issue of globalization, you work for the UAW in terms of multinationals, in organizing, and could you explain how you tried to leverage companies that had locations around the world?
Well, yeah, I mean, I was the organizing director for a while under Bob King for the UAW, and a couple of years after that. But these companies, a company like Nissan is union all over the world, except in the U.S. South, even South Africa, Europe, everywhere, and except the United States South, meaning Mississippi and Tennessee. And so we tried to mobilize global solidarity. We threatened to do a global boycott. The French government is the largest shareholder of the car company Renault, and the Renault is the controlling shares of Nissan. They control Nissan. So we did a lot of work with Danny Glover, the actor workers. We sort of had a global campaign. But it's my experience is it's very difficult. I mean, I've been participating in a lot of global campaigns, and they turn out to be a lot of meetings and conferences and rallies. But my situation, my belief is that even if you have a global strategy, organizing has to be local. That's much more true in the service sector, which I mostly focus on today. But it's also true in manufacturing. Having huge community support and huge worker support is a critical thing. The global stuff is an add-on. It's frankly very difficult to get global unions to leverage something real for another union in another country. I know everybody, solidarity is important. We all support each other, but it's hard enough to get unions in this country to support each other or within their own thing. So I just think global organizing is a little bit more rhetoric than reality, honestly, but I do it. And what we did in France was great. It put some pressure on Nissan, but the key pressure, what we didn't do is we didn't run, unlike Spot Coffee, we didn't run a global boycott or a domestic boycott, where the UAW leadership decided, in their judgment, I didn't agree with it, not to run a boycott after Nissan ran the most vicious anti-union campaign, I believe, in modern American history. They didn't even talk about it much. Spent $12.5 million, and I don't know, in 3.5 weeks to basically imply the plant would shut down and go to Mexico and terrorize a group of 5,000, mostly 90% African-American workers, and engendered huge racism within Mississippi to fight the union with radio spot and talk shows, person after person saying, you people, meaning the Black workers, should be thankful you're not digging ditches and picking cotton. You better not vote for that union or the plant will go to Mexico. So there was that campaign was teed up for a boycott, just like the Spot Coffee was. The difference is the labor leader at Workers United made a decision to defend the workers with the community, whereas honestly, the UAW leaders, those are past leaders, not current leaders, made a decision in their best judgment not to run a boycott. And if you don't make an employer suffer a consequence for doing what Nissan does, then you don't bring any real power to the table for workers. The workers themselves had a committee of over 300 people and did a really good job on the ground. So anyway, that's, I mean, the UAW is a very good union and a good union to support. And that was just, I feel that sometimes we shy away from this type of public fight and underestimate the goodwill of the public. If we just put a question about, do you really want to buy a car from a company that treats people that way? I think that's my experience is we get a lot of support if we run a comprehensive campaign. So it's not the NLRB or the labor board, the court of law, it's a court of public opinion these companies are worried about. And I think that's in these virtue signaling days of Amazon and being holier than thou and companies, shutting down a day for global climate justice and claiming they care a lot about Black lives. They don't treat their own Black workers very good or white workers. And there's a lot of what the young people call virtue signaling. I think these companies like Amazon or a lot of other major companies are very vulnerable today to both a bottom-up campaign by their own workers and a top-down campaign with the public.
I mean, Robert, you have experience organizing in the South, particularly among service workers. What do you see as the great challenges that we face?
Well,
Also at state
I see myself more as a moderator than a
Okay.
participant, but
Well, Robert, speak up.
I worked on a campaign that created by Stephen Lerner and Tom Balanoff called Justice for Janitors, which also bypassed the National Labor Relations Board and very much involved the workers committed to each other and committed to fight it in the public arena, which Richard's talking about. So rather than fighting the contractors, it was the building owners. And they were janitors in commercial office buildings. And obviously the commercial buildings are in the public, and the people who own them and the people who work there don't know about the janitors. They're sort of invisible workers. But when the workers demonstrate their concerns and their issues and the exploitation, which is incredible, especially for immigrant workers, where employers are knowingly hiring undocumented workers and then exploiting that fact. By bringing these issues to the public and demonstrating and causing severe consequences for the building owners, they've achieved a great level of success. And it's been demonstrated in city after city. And Service Employees International Union is very proud of this campaign, and they continue to do this campaign.
I mean, I'm a state employee, teaching at the University of Georgia since '82, although I'm on unpaid leave right now to run for office. But with the right to work laws in Georgia, and I think in all of the South and many states which have passed such legislation, we really don't have the right to engage in collective bargaining, let alone to strike. So the whole process of unionization might appear to be very problematic from the outset, because it's not clear what you really can deliver under those limitations. And the approach being taken and the effort is being led by the Communication Workers of America, which has organizing efforts not only here in Georgia for the entire state university system, but also in Tennessee. They're taking a kind of industrial unionization approach, namely, it's going to apply to all employees, faculty, custodial, cafeteria, maintenance, even graduate students and the like. Again, I think that the path to victory is going to have to require, as you're suggesting, public support. And you sort of saw that in various teacher strikes that took place in rather Republican-leaning states, where the teachers were not allowed to strike, probably not even allowed to engage in collective bargaining, but they did it, and they succeeded. And I think they had a lot of support on the way.
You mentioned industrial unionism. I think that's a key concept that I think the mistake we made in the labor movement, particularly in the service sector, is you cannot what we call hot shop, meaning organize one hot target and not commit to organize other companies in that same industry. So in Spot Coffee's case, that was never a Spot Coffee project in Buffalo. It's a industrial restaurant coffee shop model. And we've now had campaigns going in a couple other places. We've won another election recently, and so it's an attempt to move throughout the whole industry. We started with the biggest player, perhaps in Buffalo, but that's the concept that from the very beginning, and the workers themselves committed. Understand it's not just a Spot Coffee. It is a shop by shop strategy. It's not associational. I think the so-called alt unions and associational models are silly, and they don't build worker power. They build websites or Facebook pages, but and all the kind of protests, unless the goal is to organize a union and have a contract, all these kind of victories where the company gives paid sick days and we brag about it. That's, as Robert knows, that's what companies do to defeat unions. Nissan raised pay $6 an hour, but then raised productivity, cut other benefits for temp workers. They raised pay $6 an hour to buy them off the union. It didn't work so good for that group of workers, but I think the key is to have for unions, the unions also to do a bigger project like that have to put their money where their mouth is. And again, as Robert knows, there's always an internal tension in the labor movement with, there's always been a struggle to get unions to, some unions at least, to prioritize organizing ahead of things like politics. And so organizers, we believe that it's organizing that comes first and electoral politics weigh them, second, and that we shouldn't be an adjunct to a corporate Democratic Party or to any party for that matter. It's you don't build worker power through statutory reform. And you can raise the minimum. I was on a panel recently when the students were mad because I wasn't, people were mad at me, myself and somebody from Unite here, not mad, but they were saying, why aren't you more for the minimum wage? I said, we're not against it. I contribute money to living wage workers. But, my brother from the Unite here said, well, we don't fight in DC for 15 because we fight for $26.50 and health insurance and a pension, which is what the starting wage of a room attendant is in DC. That's the difference in statutory reform and having the right to organize and have a union in the hotels there. So.
You were mentioning organizing at different levels. I know there's some people who want to say that one of the weaknesses of the American labor movement is there's no sectoral unionization and collective bargaining. And I know that you're critical of that. And I was wondering if you could say something about what you think of the shortcomings of that approach.
Totally supportive of the concept of having a sectoral strategy to organize. That's what we're doing in Buffalo. We have an industry strategy, industrial unionism. So I'm not that interested in sectoral bargaining like some people are talking about as, when Biden gets elected, let's create works councils like they have in Germany and co-determination. I've been through that. I spent a lot of time in Germany with the German unions as organizing director of UAW. I worked with IG Metall. I was in the plants and met with the Works Council, Volkswagen, Mercedes, all of these things. I mean, as one friend of mine in the industrial said, you have to understand, you have a stronger labor movement through enterprise-based unions. These are very cooperationist organizations, and they're not bad if whatever fits. I just don't think wage boards and bureaucratizing, what I would call bureaucratizing, setting up bureaucracies that set pay and benefits is the answer. I think this is based. I read articles about people saying that Biden should make #1 sectoral bargaining because we can't organize business by business, millions of workers. I think that makes me nervous that when you look at the PRO Act is great. We just have to fight for a law this time that makes a difference. The last law that Obama proposed, if it passed, EFCA would have been actually, I think, made it harder to organize, not easier. So I think the politicians should really think hard and understand and talk to organizers about and labor leaders too, about passing a bill this time that really would make a difference. But I think using your chips to try to create wage boards or sectoral bargaining, in my view, is a mistake. I think it's based on the assumption it's too hard to organize. So let's find an easy way. Let's find the magic bullet. That's what everyone always looks for legislatively. A magic bullet, but that is not going to build worker power. It's no more than raising. I'm not against minimum wages. Maybe sectoral bargaining is fine, but I think it's a big mistake when you not to focus on what would fundamentally make a difference to make it easier to organize. And if you make it easier to organize, when you have people committed to doing it, we will organize millions and millions of people. But it takes a commitment. The law itself won't make a difference. Even if we have a great law, the unions still have to step up and do it, and so the workers. But I think there's a real danger with Biden of listening to some voices we've listened to for decades, and some are in academia, that the elites universities that have never talked to a worker, but they really are more enamored. I mean, Mayor Pete was like this. Some people are more enamored with co-determination and fancy names, and really just want to understand the problem of union organizing is vicious employer opposition, and co-determination does not speak to that. And stronger labor laws with teeth, like the PRO Act has in it. PRO Act is very good, is written, and we should fight for it and pass it, but not water it down, which is what always happens when somebody gets elected that isn't committed to what you believe. So Biden hopefully will live up to what he's saying and really not compromise and pass the law. When the Republicans get office, they pass laws that try to destroy us. We should actually, when we get office, have sharper elbows and pass laws that would be fundamentally meaningful to the workers in this country to organize.
Yeah, Richard, could you explain the PRO Act to everyone? I'm not asking you to bargain against yourself, but sometimes in these proposals for reforms, they're watered down so that there's nice little bows on packages that are not very meaningful. Well, in terms of the PRO Act, in terms of what are really the essential issues?
I mean, the essential issues, and I think the people that the AFL-CIO, the people that constructed this and the different unions have done a really good job with it. The essential issue is right now employers dominate the election process. It's not like election that Richard's running for. Employers call you into meetings 4 hours a day, threaten you, fire a union leader. There's no penalties, no remedies. They dominate the process. There's no equal time. This creates equal access, equal time, $50,000 penalties, quadruple back pay, a real penalty for doing it, and you have an option of card check election, but a quick election. But the main thing is it's not that complicated. It just sets an election almost like you'd have in the regular society where the employer cannot dominate, fire with impunity. And gives the union really access that has first contract arbitrations, which means the union can't win and then they force a strike. I think those are the main provisions. And they sound simple, but put them in and would make a fundamental difference. But I don't want to make it think that we're ever going to legislate our way out of anything. And frankly, with this law, I'll believe it when I see it. I think the labor movement has to hold the politicians' feet to the fire. And people really have to go in there and not water it down. Otherwise, it's meaningless. And so I don't hold my breath for this. I don't believe we need to wait for the PRO Act to organize. I think that's silly. I think, as I said earlier, I have never seen a better moment to organize. I've talking to right now with a lot of Amazon workers, a lot of other workers. And I think people want to organize, but they do want a union. They don't want an app. kind of
I mean, I do. I'm running for the Senate, so I'm interested in thinking about.
We need you in there because you're one of the few politicians if elected won't compromise. Damn it!
Well, I'm trying to think of legislative measures that would, for example, make it as easy as possible to organize. And
equal access. Don't fire
well, you're drawing the comparison between elections as we have them, in the political sphere, and how they operate. And I think, when we have elections in the political sphere, we don't have to sign up any number of cards before we have an election. It's understood this is just part of our rights, our freedom, that we have elected representatives. I think the same thing should apply to every workplace. It should be understood as a given right that you are to have representatives who will collectively bargain. You have the right to strike, and the election should be as automatic as possible. And we could do that by law. You don't need cards. You don't need any of that. You just have mandated elections. And that way we go from 6% to, well, close to 100%.
I'll take it.
And the other side, as you mentioned, the limitations of worker co-determination. Now, obviously, if you don't have unions, worker co-determination is kind of, it's very powerless. But if you have unions and then you add co-determination, not as in Germany and other European countries, whereas, as I understand it, the worker representation is really not equal. But if we had it as really equal, where 50% of boards of director seats, and I also mean in the public sector, like boards of regents or school boards, were to be allotted to employees elected by their peers. And this would involve being able to really prevent management from doing anything they wanted to, such as pay super salaries to CEOs, or send jobs abroad, or pollute, or whatever else, or sell off assets to increase, shareholders' prices. I think this could make a difference with the other side of it, that we fully empower employees to have union representation as just an understood fact of what it means to have a job. And also to apply that, of course, in all of these new industries where workers are not in any direct contact with one another and where organizing is extremely difficult, like Uber, Lyft. Amazon has this gigantic effort, I think it employs 500,000 people, called the Mechanical Turk, where they sort of farm out all of this kind of software development and things like that.
The Uber list is another part of the PRO Act, is these folks would be made what they really are, as employees, not independent contractors. And the Trump labor board obviously wouldn't see the world that way. Hopefully the Biden board will make that ruling, then you could organize hundreds of thousands or millions of these workers, Instacart, Uber, Lyft. I mean, this kind of gig economy is a scheme. It's silliness that these are not workers. I mean, Uber says we don't fire anybody, we're not an employer, we deauthorize. What's that? It's just silliness. So everybody just goes, oh, the gig economy. I mean, when apps are no longer new, gig economy is kind of an old name, and even a lot of, we need new unions. I mean, it's like, I don't want to be old-fashioned about it, but there is power, there's capitalism, the capital, and bosses don't care about alt unions or they really don't want a union contract. And the idea of a union contract is you can't give with one hand and take with the other. You've got a contract for all aspects of your labor. It seems like a simple notion, but we should be, I think all these things are good. And the Works Council is good if you can, particularly the board is good if you can have that deciding vote. The question is that 50-50.
It has to be a deciding vote.
The problem in Germany is 50-50 in Germany, but deciding vote is management. So. But I do think that I just worry that sometimes we get too grandiose. My wife in the other room here, who Robert, you both were good friends with, it matters both of you, has an excuse. Grandiose vision is an excuse for laziness. So
I mean, one other thing that I think could be dealt with legislatively is, what I know that a lot of labor unions and organizers are confronting, and that's often called misclassification.
Yeah.
Employers are more and more, they're on the one hand, they're classifying employees as contractors, as you just mentioned, or they're also using temps and hiring new people at a certain level of hours and not paying them the same benefits, let alone wages. I think one could have a law requiring that all employees or contractors or whatever you want to call them are going to have the same prorated wages and benefits. Yeah. So there's no way they can get away from it.
Exactly. I mean, Nissan, when we had the election there, we were fighting in Mississippi. And I remember half the plant, just about 45% of the plant in Mississippi of 5,000 workers were temps. And these are perma temps, been there up to 14 years. And in Tennessee, of the 7,000 workers, 65% were temps. These are all perma temps, to make your point. The clergy that we rallied in the community, the great clergy group in Mississippi, the UAW organized, had a good saying. It was, Nissan, lead us not into temp nation.
Well, the same thing happening in academia, as you probably know. I've been at the University of Georgia since '82, and the university has grown from about 22,000 students when I was there. It's now about 40,000, and they have definitely not increased the number of tenured faculty. But now more than half the teaching is done by adjuncts or graduate students. And as you know, elsewhere, I think nationally speaking, the number of full-time teaching staff at universities is really, tenure is becoming a smaller and smaller fraction. You have all of these adjunct people really being paid poverty wages, no benefits. And that's how they're doing it more and more. And of course, you don't have unionization in most of these places.
You should be a U.S. Senator. You could actually accomplish something for us.
Well, I'm hoping that our national government can be pushed in these directions. Obviously, it takes things on the street and on the picket lines as well as at the ballot box. But
yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking, graduate students and adjuncts have a tremendous amount of power because if they have such a substantial portion of the teaching load. But as I recall, 100 years ago, is adjuncts and graduate students have to worry about their careers, so therefore they don't, they have to worry in terms of advancement. But now, when in fact they have such little chance of be getting on tenure tracks, doesn't that sort of increase the militancy and the possible militancy of graduate students across the country and adjuncts? Because if I'm not mistaken, Richard, hasn't there been quite a bit of success in this organizing?
Yeah, I mean, SEAU, AFT, UAW have done a fabulous job organizing adjuncts, grad students. The UAW kicked off the grad student organizing a couple of decades ago at NYU. Really good stuff. And yet, as you know, because of the tremendous exploitation, what Richard was knowing, this is part of the whole false economy. We don't need full-time people. We'll just call you an adjunct and pay you nothing and, get away with murder here. So, and the grad students is, they're, but they all face stiff employer opposition too. A lot of places. I mean, the stats that Richard used, public sector, private sector, the reason that there's such a huge difference in the union density of public and private is because of employer opposition. And, the South is interesting because, right to work's not a good law. PRO Act does away with right to work too, but we have some of our best locals in right to work states. And even we were able to organize. Right to work is not a main impediment to organizing. It is an impediment, particularly in high turnover places like restaurants. But the main impediment is vicious employers that violate people's civil rights to organizing in a law that doesn't penalize them.
What's just for those academics who are interested is that the National Labor Relations Act was passed in 1935, and in the first few years of the administration of that act, it was against the law for an employer to oppose the union in terms of giving a speech. And so, it wasn't the result of brilliant legal work that this rule came up. It was because of the fact that workers were so militant and they had such a sense of purpose of organizing that it had the effect is like, okay, well, we can tolerate unions in some respect when we know that by putting the lid on it, it would make it worse. There's a great law review article called the Judicial De-Radicalization of the National Labor Relations Act, which shows how that provision interpretation went down the tube later, and then employers started talking about free speech and everything else, and then in terms of Taft-Hartley, et cetera, without giving a boring law discussion. It just wants to show you that the relationship between the law in terms of employer rights and employee rights is a reflection of how much power the union has. And that's why what Richard's talking about in terms, it's basically talking about building power is the most effective way to achieve results.
You should run the labor transition group. Seriously, that's a smart enough. You guys are smart. My wife told me beforehand, because she knows you guys' academic background. They went to really smart schools and they're really smart. Why are you on a panel with them? You went to the University of Kentucky. But we have a better basketball team, believe me. But what are you doing?
Right?
They're too smart for you.
They should get.
Well, Richard's written 22 books, Richard.
I haven't read 22 books.
Well, I mean, besides the act you just referred, what other legislative proposals do you think would be important that you would want anyone you supported, or that you think the labor movement should support, to be advocating?
That have to do with organizing rights, or
in general, organizing and employee rights?
I'm only interested in organizing rights because I think if workers have power, they'll figure the rest of it out.
Yeah.
And they don't need a bunch of, I don't really think the focus should be like, let's give everybody paid sick days. Because again, I think that's a mistake to legislate benefits. Capitalists and bosses will figure out a way to take that out from workers one way or the other. When the minimum wage in Ontario, where I work a lot in Toronto, went up a year and a half ago, $3 an hour from $11 to $14. Tim Hortons laid off tens of thousands of people the next day, or 18,000 people or something like that. When Walmart gives a pay increase, they up productivity, they lay off workers sometimes, they reduce benefits, or they don't give away, you need, I think anything that makes it easier to organize is more important in trying to think that we can do a benefit social safety net. That's just maybe that's my one-dimensional thinking as an organizer.
Well, I'll tell you what happened when you think of it as a safety net, as opposed to, let's say, a job guarantee. In the 18th century in England, when the Industrial Revolution was just beginning to get underway and the rural peasantry were being decimated, and I'm saying this from this book by Carl Polanyi, The Great Transformation, there was a movement that pushed for what today could be called universal basic income. They basically wanted everyone, because the peasantry was getting wrecked, to have enough of a payment for them to be able to buy bread, which was regarded as the means of subsistence. So what happened? Everyone got this, and the employers figured out they didn't have to pay workers what they were paying them. They could subtract from their pay the amount of this universal basic income. And I think you see that in what you're saying if you think in terms of a safety net. But if, on the other hand, you think in terms of a job guarantee, that sort of nullifies all these arguments that, well, employers are going to lay off people if they have to pay higher wages and so forth. But then it's kind of moot, because people who are laid off will be offered work, and hopefully not at a living wage, but at a fair wage, starting at what you're talking about for people in DC. And, we're in a different situation.
That makes sense. I mean, I'm an organizing chauvinist. I don't know anything else. So I'm just trying to, the frustration is this, that I'm so suspicious of the Democratic Party, that they're going to take the path of least resistance. They're talking Biden, everybody's talking a good line now. I've seen this play out before. It's going to get watered down. And I know when we had a labor law reform, even though it wasn't a very good bill under Obama, labor leaders went to the White House and said, okay, Barack, you don't have to pass labor law reform. While we had a Senate and could have passed it, we will help you. You're right. Let's get national health insurance, which he certainly did not get, but let's get national health insurance. We'll put labor law reform in the back burner. Well, fast forward, Republicans take over the Senate. If we don't have a Senate, it doesn't matter. But if we have a Senate, we should go get a bill right away that makes a difference and make it, all these other things are great, and do all the other things, but make it legal for workers to organize. It hasn't really been a fundamental change in the law since 1935. And I just get afraid that every other fancy highfalutin, thing is in there, and every other bill, and it's not going to bankrupt the company. It's just saying, I was fired for organizing my factory 40 something years ago. It took me 6.5 years to win my job back through the National Labor Relations Board, which I've always called since then the No Labor Rights Board. and there's not, I got almost no back pay because I made as much money in the interim when they take that out of your back paycheck. We just had workers fired at another coffee shop in Buffalo where they were fired. They were awarded back pay. And then the government says, well, you have to pay unemployment back. Then the owner said, I'm going to call for unemployment. He says, okay, here's your back pay, and screw you people. You destroyed my company for organizing a union, threatening him more. After this is a settlement of a labor law violator, a guy named Bob Newman at Perks Coffee in Buffalo. And then we had to pull our charges last week. He was found the merit, the complaint was issued, and we had to send back the back checks to Mr. Newman. Why? Because the labor board, labor insists it's not a penalty, it's just a remedy, and they have to pay unemployment back. And when you pay unemployment back, then you're not getting unemployment. Therefore, you have to pay $6,000 you each got from the CARES Act back too. So you would lose $6,000 actually by taking unemployment from the NLRB. This is a type of insanity that comes through the nation's labor laws. And we should just fix it. It isn't complicated. $50,000 penalty, PRO Act, immediate reinstatement. Don't take 6.5 years to litigate, and then, again, I'm not holding my breath for any of this, and I'm not waiting for it to organize. And I don't think we need it to organize, by the way, but it would kind of be nice after, almost 100 years to make it, Trump says law and order. How about law and order for workers? Simply to say, employers should be big enough. They don't have to really fire people or delay elections for months. why they're such scary cats. Let their workers vote. They shouldn't have to dominate and harangue and force people to have a meeting for 4 hours in a row every day, have a meeting. In Virginia, we had a meeting here, a couple of years ago, where every morning, the 21 days leading up to the election, every morning they had a 2-hour meeting on company time, mandatory, haranguing people about the union. That in itself is coercive to people. It'd be like if you were running for election, your opponents could take people in, Richard, and say, well, we're going to have a meeting for 2 hours, and this guy doesn't have any equal time. So we have a lot of problems of our own electoral process and voter suppression, but the voter suppression under a union election is much worse. I hate to say it.
I mean, I think there's one aspect of fundamental corruption in the electoral system that applies to employees, and I have it as sort of the last measure of my employee bill of rights, and that is it's pretty impossible for an employee to run for political office, especially for statewide or national office when it's really a full-time effort, because you've got to stop working, meaning no income, no benefits related to work, which of course in the US is more severe than elsewhere. And then in all likelihood, you're not going to have your job waiting for you at the end of the election. So, I mean, we see this in Congress. There are almost no employees, no union members in Congress. They're all on average millionaires, or they're professionals or independently wealthy. So, why not have as a matter of statutory right that if you're an employee and you run for office, you should have replacement income during the duration of the race. You keep all your benefits and you're guaranteed to get your job back if you lose. Then employees who make up 90 to 95% of us who are breadwinners could actually have a right to run for office. And
That's good. I'm down for that
I think
one.
that could change a
You
lot.
got to add one more to your list. I was looking at your list of just your Bill of Rights. You had one more.
Yeah.
If you fire a worker for organizing a union, your name is Jeff Bezos, you go to jail for the rest of your life. Jeff Bezos.
Well, what do you see? I mean, you bring up Bezos, and of course, this is the richest man in the world. His company maybe is employing as many people or more as Walmart or any of these other low wage people. What strategy do you think there should be to be able to unionize Amazon?
Yeah, a good question. I'm involved in I won't go into the details, but involved in that a little bit currently. But I think it's the same. You need a good worker committee, and you need a big hand. But I think Bezos is vulnerable. He has a lot of enemies and no friends. I know I testified against Amazon over their anti-union stance here with the building trades, trying to build non-union, and near where I live, 5 minutes from down the road in Virginia, where they're building a new headquarters. I think Amazon's very vulnerable. They have only enemies, no friends. The Republicans don't like them. The Democrats don't like them. I think they don't need more enemies. I think they're vulnerable. I think they're a good target. Some people say they're too big. I don't agree with that. I think some of these big companies like Starbucks, Amazon are very vulnerable if the unions will go after them. Now you have to have a strategy, but I think Amazon workers will organize unions over the next few years. And I talk to Amazon workers almost daily, and different, I'm not going to say where, but it's not relevant anyway. But I think Amazon's kind of labor relations wise, kind of in the 1950s, honestly. I think other companies are smarter. I'm not going to critique it because I don't want to tell them, but I think they have the stupidest union avoidance labor relations policy. And I don't think they know which way is which. It's like, Starbucks, they have one good thing. They have a good latte. He has Prime. He invented a good concept. These guys aren't geniuses, and they're not the smartest people on earth. The smartest people on earth have something better to do than bust labor unions, which is what Walmart and Amazon do. And I met with one of the companies I just named. I won't mention, but not too long ago, they asked me. I gave a speech and I used their name, and they said they'd meet with me off the record if I didn't mention their name. So I won't mention their name, although I already did mention it once. So I met with this company and I told them, and they were saying, I said, it's shameful. They say, we're not anti-union. Our employees just don't want your product. They don't want a union. I said, well, we're not a product, we're a movement. But you had no credibility because you had how many thousands of stores you have? And there's not one union. And when some worker in Pippa Passes, Kentucky, my home, wants to organize a union, you fly 10 corporate lawyers and smash them like a bug so those 20 people can't organize. It's pathetic. If you were smart, you let a few organize just to claim you're not anti-union. but you have no evidence of that because you're 100% non-union and you're vicious anti-union. I think time's catching up with people. I just think, again, Spot Coffee showed me that, and workers everywhere. Millennials and Gen Z, unions are so out, we're in. They want a fight, and they have a class analysis, which is critical, I think, here. And they have a class analysis about a lot of things, and they know they're going to be poor. There's no great jobs. They want middle class life, but they know how they're going to get it. So I just think that that's who's organizing now. I mean, the people I helped organize Spot Coffee, but I just basically stood back and watched these mostly young people take over, and now they're organizing other places as well. And same at Gimme Coffee. That's another one upstate New York. I helped organize. The people there, led by a person named Sam Mason, Caleb Harrington. Sam and Caleb are, again, millennials, I guess. And I don't know, they just know what they want and how to do it. We should let them lead the labor movement. I'm not nominate one of them for head of the AFL-CIO. That would be good. But I'm just saying that I just think that there's a burning anger that we can take advantage of now. It's a fun fight. It's a good fight. It's a righteous fight. I think I feel that sort of tables are a little more level these days. If we engage in the fight, though, you can't expect to have it legislated, into your hands.
Well, it's kind of staggering when you look at all of these high-tech giants. I mean, take Apple, for example, which is maybe with Amazon, the richest company in human history. And, people on the upper echelons, they've made a ton of money. But then you go to the employees in Apple stores, which have the biggest sales per square foot of any stores in the world. They make a pittance. And same thing for all the other workers that are, the so-called geniuses in these stores and all these people. Same thing with Google. Same thing with Twitter, and I'm sure all of these corporations. You have this large, completely unorganized labor force. The people at the top are reaping in, millions and millions of dollars, but the rest are not doing so well, and it would seem very ripe. But it's also very difficult.
Richard, they know they're doing it too. When I met with this one group, it was 8 people in the room with top executives from the president on down. This a well-known large corporation. I said, it's just shameful. You are good on green economy. You are good. You do give money to the NAACP. You are good on climate change, but you're horrible on terrorizing. And the word is terrorism, corporate terrorism, your own workers where they want to organize a union. And they don't even fight back. They just look down, right? And I just think I just think there's a vulnerability. I'm not saying you're going to guilt trip them into anything, that's for sure. But I do think there's an opportunity you can see it with one of the Black Lives Matter movement, in my lifetime, the most inspirational movement I've seen since the Civil Rights movement. I mean, incredible movement. It's a time of protest led by young people. It's a time of fighting back, and the labor movement should be in the middle of that. This guy, Gary Banadana, who's a young millennial labor leader who led the Spot Coffee thing, he sent me I saw a picture of him on the internet holding up a sign at the Black Lives Matter demonstration in Rochester that said, "Which side are you on?" And I think there's a merging of there's always been a historic merging of the civil rights and the labor movement. It's
ask you this in terms of how you see organizing occurring. The labor movement in the United States peaked, as I understand it, in terms of percentage of the workforce that was unionized, was in 1954 when there were 35%. Now we're down to 10%. And, all the major unions are really hurting, I think. And so the question is, when you talk about, and of course, there are more unorganized workers than ever to be organized. Meanwhile, the share of wages in our national income is at an all-time low. Like you say, it's a perfect storm for something to happen. But is it going to happen because unions decide they're going to put more of their dwindling resources into organizing, or is the organizing going to be done through some other means?
Well, I think
some statutory ideas, but obviously there's another side to it as well.
I do think that leadership is important here. You got to have labor leaders that are going to take on the fight and members that are demanding they do. But the good news is there are some pretty spectacular organizing success. Robert talked about Justice for Janitors. Unite Here has organized thousands and tens of thousands of new workers until the pandemic hit. And I do think that organizing is very difficult, but not too difficult. And I do think there is a new generation of people. And I do think there is a sudden spontaneous movement of anger of working people exacerbated by the pandemic, not only the pandemic, but exacerbated by it, that has presented a good opportunity. I mean, you see a lot of just organizing springing up of independent unions. And frankly, that I'm all for that too. If people want to, I've actually been talking to people recently and helping people. I run a school called the Inside Organizer School, and we've been helping people form independent unions, Uber, Lyft drivers, and restaurant workers and other people. And it's kind of an interesting school, and it's a kind of a part school labor retreat. And some of these Uber, Lyft drivers don't know that they've signed up 9,000 people. I think that if you could organize 1 million people at Uber, Lyft with a little bit of effort, and maybe in changing that one little part of the law to make them not independent contractors, I actually do think the time, given the time, if a little better law or better law, you've got the worker anger, unions got the resources, for God's sakes, just don't give it all to the Democratic Party. That's the answer, and build power, understand where power comes from. I do think we're going to see a lot of organizing, but I'm optimistic about that.
I'll mention one wrinkle of this. I find people down here, when I say down here in Georgia, I tell them that when I was growing up first in Queens and then in a suburb on Long Island, Roslyn, I went to public schools. And in my public high school, there was actually a whole course devoted to the history of the labor movement. Now, needless to say, in the school curriculum here, and I know this from my 3 children who all went to the public schools, they never learn anything about unions. It's never brought up. And I think people in general, they don't know about unions. They don't know what they've done. They don't know the struggles. And
yeah, but
there's something wrong with our public education that is contributing to the situation.
Too, but people know when they're getting exploited, and if the union shows up and talks to them, they want a union, and then you have to contend with employer opposition. And it's kind of like in the South a little bit, like people used to say, well, Southern workers don't want to organize. Robert can speak to this. Some of my best organizing successes in the South. I've never found the South. The only thing that's more difficult in the South is the political establishment. But I don't think Southern workers are any less oriented towards unions. I actually think Southern workers maybe are more oriented. I'm not sure there's a difference. But it's an unspoken truth in the South that Southern companies or foreign companies that move to the South, like in the auto industry, it's unspoken truth that they move there to avoid unions. Sure. So Southern workers aren't stupid, they're smart. And they know they came here to avoid unions. So when a company like this one says, and yeah, we'll move to Mexico if you vote for one, that gives pause. And I get all that, but I think the South is cool, but it's not like Southern workers aren't organized. People say organize the South, well, organize the East and West and North, but unions have to commit to it. Whenever, every decade, Robert can testify this, somebody, the AFL-CIO somewhere gets criticized, you're not organizing the South. We're not organizing the North and East and West much either. Okay, you're not organizing the South. I grew up in the South, so I understand it, but you're leaving the South out. So what do? We go to Atlanta and we conduct a 1,000-person convention called Organizing in the South, and then no organizing comes of it. It's not about labor bureaucracy or conventions, but it is about labor making commitment. But there are good labor leaders today that want to step up and do this. I talked to some of them, and I do think there's a recognition now coming off the pandemic that there should be an upsurge in organizing. And if you have a Biden in office, not Trump, let's put, maybe we had the right mix now, a better law, a better moment where we're with worker anger, and some labor leaders that actually want to have a fight. And the ones that don't have a fight, then heck with them. Who cares? Their unions won't grow. They'll die. The others will. That's fine. Or we form independent unions, which again, if no one wants to organize Uber or Lyft, I'm helping them organize now. And more power to them. It's the main part is to get a union, whether, ideally a union will help you do it, but if they won't, do your own.
Well, look, if 90% of American employees are non-union, then if they're going to become unionized, it's going to involve a lot of independence.
It does, but don't let the numbers bug you. I mean, moral authority and what your impact to society isn't just numbers and percentages. I get it, but you know, Joe Hill changed the world and other people by just being an organizer. I've never, again, I can't, it's been mobilizing to get, this is where you, my job is to go out tomorrow and figure out how to organize a couple of restaurants. This is all I know how to do. I don't know how to organize tens of thousands of people. You got the wrong guy on here. I just go talk to workers and organize the same thing I've been doing for the last 40 years. And if I can get 10 workers at a coffee shop to organize, I've done, you know, hopefully I've helped them and done justice with my life. I don't know how you change the world except to do what works on a bigger scale. And when you look for shortcuts and magic answers, then we sets us back. So that's
Well, I'm pursuing a campaign that's trying to give some statutory help.
Richard, I want to hear, Rich, I think it would be helpful for you to outline what your employee bill of rights are. And I know it is a vision. So I think it would be interesting to hear what it is.
I'll start with the beginning, because I think you can't talk about employee rights unless you have a job. So I think, first of all, the basis of employee rights is that the right to work, the true right to work, be recognized. That if necessary, government steps in and offers a job to anyone who can't find one. And it should be a job not at a living wage, but a fair wage. And I think that means something that keeps pace with inflation and the growth of the wealth of the nation, which puts us starting above $20 an hour, if you want to think about where we are now. And then I think also you want to ensure that people who no longer can work or can't work because of disabilities should have that same replacement income. And I think that sort of sets the bottom on which other employee rights can flower. And I think one part of it is that you need to have union organization at all workplaces, at all enterprises where you have multiple employees. So I think that should be there. And I think the law
top of the list. At the top of the list.
And that's where we move when we talk about employment. You have to have that kind of organization. And it's not that you say we're going to let it happen if I don't know, people happen to sign a number of cards against all the opposition management. No, it has to happen. We hold the election and we do it in a way where we ensure it's fair, and people then can do that. And at the same time, and by the way, that applies to not just full-time workers, but part-timers, contract people, gig employers, all of them are going to be represented. And they all have to have the right to strike. And then I'm also for worker co-determination. I think that can help, together with all these other things. You know, I think it's crucial that both in the public and private sector, you have half the seats at least filled by employees, and that what they want cannot be overridden by management. One of the shocking things I've come across here, and I suspect it applies not just to Georgia, but employees of the school system are not allowed to be on the school board. Well, I think half the school board seats should be filled by employees. Likewise, the boards of regents. I think no employee should be fired or laid off without documented proof, that documented grounds for doing that. You know, no more firing at will. And I think that we have to have the same benefits and wage levels for all employees, whether they're part-time or not. Obviously prorated, but you want to have that. Also, you want to not allow any contracts that require binding arbitration, which I know is becoming more and more a thing for many employers. Also, I'm against non-compete clauses, which are being used by more and more employers to prevent their employees from working in another company, which also means that they have more freedom to fight for their rights on the job. I also want to prohibit mandatory overtime, which is prohibited in almost every other country in the world. I mean, we are really the exception. And that really wrecks our lives. You know, we really don't have a 40-hour week, as we all know. And mandatory overtime, I think, is something to be prohibited. And I do think that every employee should have paid family leave, paid sick leave, 9-month paid parental leave, 1 month paid vacation. These are kind of things you have in the European Union. I think we can set that floor, and then unions can push for better, for more than that. And then I also think, to cap it all off, is what I mentioned earlier, the right of an employee to be able to have replacement income if they choose to run for office, to keep benefits, and to get their job back. And so I think together that represents a new situation that would help even the playing field between employer and employee. And I think it all could be legislated. And then we can see where we go. I don't know what you think of these kind of things.
Well, if you get it all, then I don't have to organize unions anymore. You haven't done it. So let's go for it. I'll take your proposal over mine. But you know what I think? You got to just try towards the right to organize. All that stuff is good. It's all good, but just put right to organize at the top.
Yeah. Well, you have to have a job before you can organize, right?
Yeah.
The jobs have to be guaranteed, I think. Then comes next.
Yeah, there's a.
I mean, there is a connection, for instance, in terms of in industry-wide bargaining or organizing. Is that it's a classic. You are trying to take the wages out of competition, and so with the full employment, you're also helping take the wages out of competition. And just for those people who don't know, it's the right to a job is not a brand new idea. Eleanor Roosevelt and the Human Rights Declaration was forward. In fact, we had a Humphrey Hawkins bill. Hubert Humphrey, no one thinks of him as a social justice warrior, but it just shows you how far we've drifted to the right in this country. The idea of full employment is laughable, but it was a serious idea at one point.
I just don't think we get everything. And if my choice is between a sectoral bargaining and some type of wage board, which I don't believe have faith will set very high wages, just like minimum wages aren't very high, or labor law reform, I would take labor law reform so workers have power and a chance to build real unions. I don't trust the other proposal, that kind of proposal. If Richard is the one running the wage board and it's Richard's proposal, I'm all for it. I just don't trust the Democratic Party not to water.
You don't want a bureaucracy setting the wage.
Yeah, I don't trust the Democratic Party to do other, going to the Kennedy School and the Harvard this or that, and MIT professors coming up with their great systems. It's a liberal elitism, in my opinion, and it's great concepts. This is what Secretary Bob Reich did when he was in the Clinton administration. He talked about going beyond unions. We can have other proposals. It isn't just unions. There's certainly other issues besides union organizing. I don't mean to be that much of a show. Nuclear proliferation, that's a big one. War. But when it comes to labor policy, I do think for once, can we just get everybody focused on the right to organize and pass it quickly if we get a Senate? If we don't get it, that's fine. We can still organize without it. But if we do have if the window is open, we should take it. And obviously these other issues, and one good thing about the CARES Act, it shows we can afford to pay everybody $50,000 a year, and it doesn't bankrupt anybody really. So I agree that would be a great thing. But I think we have just labor law reform I don't think we're going to get the 50,000 guaranteed income, and otherwise let's just get labor law reform so we could actually give people the power to negotiate it. So,
well, Richard, I want to thank you. Okay. The cliche is organizing is a young person's avenue, and you've been a young person for a very, very long time, and plus the fact that you're taking your hard work, your creativity, et cetera, and passing it on to the next generation, and hearing your words of praise to the next generation shows that union organizing is alive and well in people's hearts, and that you've pointed out that the conditions are ripe. So I want to thank you, and Richard, you've outlined a wish list that I don't think any of us would object to, and I think you've got the point tonight from Richard that union organizing is number one. So let's close this out with Richard. You go first and give your final words, and then Richard Bensinger, you can close, and then we can have thanks for the evening.
Well, you began, Robert, by pointing out that it is important to defeat Trump and the Republican hold of Congress. But I think we're all agreed that it's not enough to turn Congress blue. It's a question of also putting in place the measures that are going to make it possible for labor to be empowered. And that, of course, involves having full rights to organize. I think it should involve as automatic union elections as possible. I think we need to have a federal job guarantee, wipe out unemployment and poverty income. And that's what also will put workers in a position where they don't have to worry about being fired, and they can really stand up and fight for all their rights harder than ever. So I think, there are struggles ahead of us on both levels, beyond this election, both in terms of getting the leaders to push for these kind of laws, and then on the other hand, for the populace at large to join in supporting the efforts of those on the ground, like Richard, and the workers that he is mobilizing to gain success that they deserve.
Richard Bensinger, it's your last straw.
Thank you, Richard, for the invite. This is fun, and good luck to you. And I admire your fight here for, trying to insert some real proposals that make a difference to working people. Instead of having the corporate democratic approach, you have a populist democratic approach, and the right one, I think. Robert, thanks for those kind words, and thanks for who you are, your years of organizing and dedication, and your really wickedly funny, as I recall, sense of humor. I started out by saying, inspired by, a lot of young people, immigrants, when people of color, it seems people that are kind of rising up. You just see a lot of protests percolating and a lot of union organizing starting to percolate, whether it's Amazon or anywhere else. The labor movement has to provide some structure to that, and funding and resources to build it up. But social movement's always been led by young people, and the labor movement today, I wish, it's such an interesting moment if you're out there and you're 25 years old or 30 years, 35 or 20, and you really want to engage in class war and have a fight on behalf of the working class and challenge capital and capitalism. The labor movement is such the right place to do it. And if you're a non-union worker, challenge your employer, and organizing your coffee shop or your Amazon fulfillment center your Facebook office, is virtual or otherwise, is so much fun and so interesting, in a way to change the world, and one step at a time. That this, maybe since the 1930s, this seems like the most interesting. The table is set exactly the right, for bad reasons, the greatest income inequality since the 1930s. But labor movement's certainly not really the only answer, but increasing union organizing, wage inequality will not be solved if unions aren't part of the answer. And so I think it's just a good moment for young people, particularly, and retirees, to get involved in the labor movement and to have the fight. It's a righteous fight, and it is the way to make a difference in people's lives. So thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. You've heard from what they say, male, stale, and pale, 3 old white men, and for those who want to go hear Donald Trump and Joe Biden, you got some more. But I can assure you that in the future, you're going to see younger, more women, people of color, and the fight, we hope, is going to be greater than ever. So thanks again. Have a great evening.
Thank you all for participating. Give my best to Ginny.
Okay.
Me too.
Hope to see all of you in person eventually. So,
Okay. Best to Ginny. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
so long, everyone.